All right, I think I can see a number of people who have joined us this morning, so welcome. And given it's a couple of minutes past 11, let's get underway. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name's Kate Simons. I'm the chairperson of the Essential Services Commission. Thanks very much for joining us today for our public forum on the draft decision of the Essential Services Commission on the 2023-2024 Victorian Default Offer. I'd like to start today's forum by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands we're meeting on today. For me, that is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands you are on today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the connection that Indigenous Australians hold to country and culture. Before we get into the session this morning, I'd like to make some introductions and draw your attention to some important housekeeping. Just please be aware we are recording this forum for publishing on our website. This recording will capture all comments and questions from attendees, including those in the chat function as well today. We're looking forward to facilitating a dedicated question and answer session as part of today's forum. But of course, if you've got any questions or comments that pop up during the speaker presentations, please feel free to type them in the chat box so that we can respond. It'd be great if you could keep your microphone muted when not speaking to avoid any feedback and background noise as well. I'd also like to remind the business representatives around the online table this morning attending the forum of their obligations under Australian competition law, and note there must be no discussion or comments, including in the chat, pertaining to market offer price changes during this session. I'd like to take a moment to introduce my fellow commissioners, senior leaders and commission staff in attendance today. If you could just give us a wave, starting with my fellow commissioners, Satish Bojani. Good morning, and Simon Corden. Good morning. And Rebecca Billings was unable to attend, but we will give her a full briefing on the forum after this morning. So on behalf of my fellow commissioners, I'd like to emphasise how pleased we are to be here today, to hear directly from stakeholders. We find it really valuable to hear firsthand from you, so we look forward to observing and listening to the areas of interest, comment and feedback today. As this is an online forum, I really encourage you to turn your cameras on. If you feel comfortable, it's great to be able to engage in that way. And please feel free to engage with the presenters and the Commission on key areas of interest, whether that be by placing a comment in the chat, by putting your hand up to make an observation or raise a query. The Commission really supports and values frank and transparent engagement with all of our stakeholders to help inform our decision making. I'm also joined by Acting CEO Marcus Crudden and Dean Wickington, who heads up our Victorian Default Offer and water teams and who will lead today's presentation on the draft decision. Marcus and Dean are supported today by the Victorian Default Offer project team led by Jonathan Roberts. And on that note, I'd also like to welcome our guest presenters. Welcome and thank you to Jane Singh from the Australian Energy Council, Stephanie Tonkin from the Consumer Action Law Centre. We will have Emma King from the Victorian Council of Social Services and Professor Bruce Mountain from the Victorian Energy Policy Centre, Victorian University. I very much look forward to your presentations and hearing your insights and views on the Victorian Default Offer draft decision at our forum today. I understand we have a large number of attendees here today, including customers, representatives from energy businesses, peak and industry bodies, and the community and consumer advocate sector. We also have observers joining us from different levels and departments within government, as well as other regulators, including the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action and the Australian Energy Regulator. I also understand there may be some representatives from the media who may also be in attendance today. So I'd like to warmly welcome all of you today and encourage everyone to participate in the discussion. We're here really to listen to you and the views you might have on our draft decision. We really value your views, comments and queries as they relate to this important decision, and your feedback forms a critical part of our decision-making process. As well as your participation today, I'd also encourage you to make written submissions to us, which are due by the 11th of April. Submissions can be made via the Engage Victoria platform, and I understand that's going to be put in the chat so that you've got access to that easily this morning. So to quickly summarise the agenda for today, Dean Wickington from the Commission will take you through our draft decision. Then we will hear from our guest speakers, starting with Stephanie, then Emma, Bruce, and then Jane, who will close out the presentations. After those presentations, we will move into our question and answer session at around 11:55 before wrapping up at around 12:15. The Q&A session will be hosted by Marcus Crudden from the Commission, and I, along with my fellow commissioners, really look forward to listening to the areas of interest raised during that session. Before I hand over to Dean to give an overview of the draft decision, I wanted to also speak to you about some customer impacts, energy consumer rights and protections, and the Commission's focus on making sure customers are aware of and getting access to all available support. So as you're probably aware, and as Dean will run through shortly, our draft decision proposes relatively large increases to the Victorian Default Offer. I would like to emphasise that the Commission absolutely understands the impact of these proposed increases on Victorian Default Offer customers amidst the broader cost of living concerns. We know about those concerns through our own direct engagement with consumers, through the advocacy of the community and social sector, through our engagement with local and state governments, and through our engagement with energy businesses, including through our recent review of the Energy Payment Difficulty Framework. We're here to help consumers to navigate the impacts of a very volatile energy market. Upholding the rights and protections of energy consumers really remains front of mind for the Commission as the impacts of those higher wholesale energy market prices begin to flow through to retail markets and consumer energy bills. Wanted to make mention that we will continue to use our full suite of regulatory tools to support and promote energy retailer compliance with those critical safeguards in place to protect Victorian energy consumers. We will continue to closely monitor how retailers are meeting their responsibilities to inform energy consumers about whether or not they're receiving the retailer's best offer, which is one of our current compliance and enforcement priorities. Keeping customers informed of whether they could access a better offer from their retailer, how much money they could save by switching to a better offer, and how to go about accessing any best offer is more important than ever. So we really want consumers to engage confidently with their retailer and in the energy market generally. We will also continue to focus on retailer obligations under the Energy Payment Difficulty Framework to provide assistance to consumers experiencing bill stress. We will be encouraging consumers that are having trouble paying their bills to reach out to their energy retailer to ask about payment plans and what concessions, rebates or utility relief grants might be available. So we want to really make sure that Victorian energy consumers are getting all the assistance they're entitled to, and that is also currently a key compliance and enforcement priority for the Commission, and we won't hesitate to take some action if we see businesses not providing customers with the assistance they're entitled to. I also wanted to mention that market offers made by retailers to customers are a matter for individual businesses, and it's inappropriate to justify changes in market offers because the Commission proposes changes to the levels of the Victorian Default Offer. We will be closely monitoring how the proposed and the final decisions on the Victorian Default Offer for 23-24 are communicated to customers, and if it's used to justify changes in market offers to customers. We really encourage consumers to access all government programs available to them. There are a number of programs designed to ease cost of living impacts or provide energy price relief. For example, a new round of the Victorian Government's Power Saving Bonus opened on the 24th of March, and that provides a $250 payment to eligible Victorian households to help ease cost of living pressures and encourage consumers to compare energy offers as well. We do know the federal government has announced that it will contribute up to $1.5 billion for power price relief, and the detail of how that will work is not yet available. Dean, at that point in time, I'll now hand over to you to present our draft decision, and thanks everyone for being here. I really look forward to the discussion today. Thanks very much, Dean.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everyone. I'll take us through at a high level our draft decision. that we've put out for feedback. I think the Commission reviews the Victorian Default Offer annually, and in doing that, we take into account a number of costs, and we're required to do that under the pricing order that's issued by the Victorian government. So we look at things like wholesale electricity costs, network costs, the retail costs that the businesses face, environmental costs, and a range of other things in addition to a retail operating margin. We've been setting the default offer since 2019, and our methodology has largely been the same since that time. This year, as you probably all know, our analysis shows that the cost to retailers of providing electricity retail services will increase. And that's mainly due to increased wholesale electricity costs. It's not just a Victorian issue. It reflects a year of price volatility in energy markets, which is making it more expensive for energy companies to buy and sell electricity across Australia. This is primarily due to the significant increases in forecast wholesale electricity costs. This has increased the prices energy retailers pay in terms of the futures contract arrangements they use to hedge the price risk they face when buying electricity from the wholesale market to supply their Victorian consumers. The table that's up on the slides now really just shows what's driving the change in the VDO that we're seeing. And it's clearly the wholesale cost component there, which is driving around 90% of the increase in costs that we estimate retailers are facing for the year ahead from July this year. Among other things, the VDO also must reflect the network costs paid by electricity retailers to the distribution businesses. Given the large impact these costs can have on the prices paid by consumers, in our draft decision, we used the Australian Energy Regulator's indicative network tariffs adjusted for changes in inflation. That's basically a placeholder at this stage till the AER makes their decision in May, and we'll update that for the final decision. So overall, the draft decision is proposing an increase of around 31% in the Victorian default offer for residential customers and 33% for small business customers. So what does that mean for a household? If you're on the VDO, the typical bill will go up by about $426 in the year, from $1,400, just a bit over $1,400 to about $1,829. The benchmark for small businesses shows a similar increase of about 33%. So for a typical small business that's using 10,000 kilowatt hours of energy per year, an increase of about $878. And for a business with 20,000 kilowatt hours a year usage, it'll increase by about $1,700. So those dollar figure increases are broadly in keeping with what we saw in default offer increases announced in other jurisdictions recently as well. Generally, just what I said earlier, that we're maintaining the same methodology. Largely, we have looked closely at some aspects of our approach, and we have proposed a change to the way we estimate the retail operating costs that come into the cost that we use to estimate the VDO. So we're proposing to move from a benchmark decision that we used that was set in 2017 to using the cost data supplied to us by retailers. And we think that's a better way to estimate the Victorian default offer. And also in this one, we've included the market intervention costs that reflect the compensation payments administered by AEMO and also the AEMC. This slide here shows the impacts and the different cost components for the VDO and the impact on a typical household. So as you can see from this slide, that the wholesale electricity prices there, that's the dark blue part at the bottom, is really driving up and explaining most of the increases in the VDO that applies to household customers. Seeing some small declines in retail and environmental costs in that as well. The impact on residential bills, or the residential bill for a VDO customer, will vary depending on their electricity usage and also which distribution zone in Victoria they actually live in. So as I mentioned before, that's an increase of about $426 for a household customer on the VDO. The next slide shows the same sort of cost stack for a small business customer with 10,000 kilowatt hours of usage per year. An increase of around $800. And then the last one is the 20,000 kilowatt hour usage benchmark. So an increase of a bit over $1,700 for those customers as well. The chart just shows a similar movement. It's really the wholesale cost driving these estimated bills higher. This chart shows the changes in wholesale costs reflected in the Victorian Default Offer over time on a per megawatt hour basis. So we've used basically the same wholesale cost methodology since we started setting the VDO, and you can see sort of over time, they've sort of since the January 2020, we've reflected declining wholesale costs in the Victorian Default Offer, ticked up a bit for the current VDO that's in place. And you can see the impact in just in the past years that's flowing through. So this chart's just showing the trend over time and the step up that we're seeing in wholesale costs reflected in the VDO that we propose to flow through from 1st of July this year. Increased wholesale electricity contract prices, as I said earlier, the main reason for the increase in the VDO. This slide shows basically a profile of contract prices over the past year, or the measurement period we had from the VDO. So from January 2022 to January 2023, you can see that the peak sort of came in around October last year, and then you had the market interventions appeared to coincide with the reduction in the futures contract prices. So that's flowed through somewhat to our estimates over the past year. And you can see since we released our decision, the contract prices that we use have stabilised a bit, but they're still almost double what they were at the same time last year. We do have Frontier Economics provide us with advice on the wholesale costs we estimate. I don't want to go into this chart. It's fairly busy, but I think the key thing to point out with this is that we asked Frontier to use a 12-month weighted average for contract prices, trade weighted average for contract prices to set our wholesale cost benchmark. So this time period broadly, the 12 years, reflects the practice of retailers building their hedge book progressively over a year or a year in advance of when the VDO is set. And what we try and do is make sure that the contract prices that we're reflecting are trade weighted. So in periods where there's lower volumes of trades, then the contract price for that period is given a lower weighting in the calculation of the VDO. So it's important to note that we do take into account the volumes in our calculation of the contract prices that retailers are facing. Thanks, Natul. So that's a high-level overview of the draft decision. We might touch on this at the end as well, but just in terms of the timelines, as Kate said, we do encourage you to make submissions. So of course we'll hear what you have to say later on, and feedback and questions. Hopefully that's helped shape submissions you can make to us via Engage Victoria, and we're looking at a submission closing date of the 11th of April. That's it for me now. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. Now we've just got our sessions with some guest speakers, and we're kicking off with Stephanie Tonkin. Morning, Stephanie. Thank you for your time today. And Stephanie is Chief Executive Officer at the Consumer Action Law Centre. Most of you will know of the Consumer Action Law Centre, but they are a focused consumer advocacy organisation that is based in Melbourne. And thanks for your time today, Stephanie, and look forward to what you have to say.
Thanks so much, Dean. Thank you for having me. And thanks to the ESC for inviting us to share our thoughts on the draft decision this morning. And I also want to say a big thank you to our Senior Policy Officer, Luke Lavelle, who's helped me and pull together these reflections today. A little bit about us, as Dean said, Consumer Action is an independent, not-for-profit consumer organisation. We specialise in consumer law and policy. On our frontline services, we're responding to over 20,000 calls and contacts annually, and we're providing people with financial counselling, legal advice, legal representation. And it's from these frontline services that we draw much of the evidence and insights to drive our policy and campaign work. We're also one of the operators of the National Debt Helpline in Victoria, and a big part of our financial counselling practice is assisting people struggling to afford their energy bills. That makes up about 10 to 12% of people calling us each month, seeking advice on what to do about energy debt. Our initial reaction to the video for 23-24, to start with, I want to make clear that overall, Consumer Action is very supportive of the video. To date, we think it's been successful in achieving the stated policy objective of providing a simple, trusted and reliably priced electricity option that safeguards consumers unable or unwilling to engage in the electricity retail market. It's this policy objective that we return to in each reset of the video. Given the current cost of living pressures facing Victorians, it's particularly important to interrogate what represents a reasonable price for the coming year. And it's in this light that we believe the video should be reduced by a small but meaningful amount. So turning to the cost of living, and before going into specific reactions on the draft decision, I want to touch on how people are being impacted by rising living costs. We're seeing increased demand for our frontline services. Calls to our financial counsellors in January and February this year are up around 30% compared to the same time in 2022. As mentioned, about 10 to 12% of people calling us are seeking advice specifically about energy debt. The most common reason for calls to our financial counselling services are currently mortgage stress and credit card debt, and then followed by energy. These other expenses inevitably impact energy debt. It's the one household budget to spend, so people will prioritise keeping a roof over their head, and the more money going towards housing costs is less that people have to put towards other expenses, food, medicine, and their utility bills. So we're hearing stories of families prioritising bills but skipping meals, or finding other ways to pay, like unregulated credit products, wage advance, buy now, pay later. And this leads to debt spirals when a payment is missed. I think it's really important to point out as well that energy debt is growing among people calling us. So in 2022, clients reported an average energy debt of just over $2,500. In 21, this figure was around $1,500. In essence, Victorians are in vulnerable circumstances and or are on low incomes. They're telling us they have little to no ability to absorb rising costs. So turning to now the specific aspects of the decision, wholesale costs. Wholesale prices, we've heard, are the major driver of the cost increase. And we accept that elevated wholesale electricity prices necessitate an increase to the 23-24 VDO. However, we do question whether the extremely elevated prices of late 22 should be included in the calculation, and do the unprecedented circumstances of the last 12 months justify a deviation from standard methodology? Should some of these costs be excluded given the broader financial position of many Victorian families? In making the final decision, we suggest the ESC takes a broader view on how to deal with the high wholesale prices of the last 12 months, as well as a trend towards lower prices in 23-24. On the retail operating cost, overall, we strongly support the ESC's decision to set the retail operating cost benchmark based on retailers' actual operating costs. And this is something we've been asking for a long time. As we said in our submission in response to the ESC's consultation paper on the 23-24 VDO, comparing retailers' actual costs to a benchmark is important to ensure that it remains reflective of current costs. Both the ESC and ACCC recently suggested that retail operating costs are declining, and we're pleased to have seen this borne out in the ESC's data collection. One question that comes to mind, though, is whether using a customer-weighted average best represents efficient. we would suggest if an efficient retailer would be reporting the costs that fall below the average retail operating costs. But then what happens if the costs increase? What review verification process does a retailer or retailers have in place to ensure the costs are efficient? But despite these minor points, we strongly support the decision to use retailer data. On retailer margin, we think this is important, we note the impact of the draft decision on retail margins. Having a percentage margin means that as other costs go up, the dollar value of the margin increases. We repeat our call that the ESC considers reducing the margin and collects retail data to understand if the current benchmark remains justifiable. Both ACCC data and ESC's data collection suggest that retailer margins are decreasing. We would also expect to see retailers' margins reduced during a period of elevated supply costs. In making the final decision, we ask the ESC to consider if a lower margin is justified should the Commission use retailer data as they have for operating costs. More generally, the ESC could consider fairness in how market intervention costs are passed through in this VDO. By including these as a variable cost, this will disproportionately impact higher consumption households who may have high levels of non-discretionary consumption due to circumstances outside their control. And these are the people calling us. For example, they're a large family or living in a house with poor energy efficiency. The ESC needs to consider equity of outcomes in how these costs are allocated in the final decision. We support the decision to include any unknown costs in the 24-25 VDO rather than through a variation to this VDO. And finally, we note the decision on consumer acquisition costs. We suggested in our submission that the ESC collect retailer data to understand if their benchmark remained valid. We note that retailer data showed the spending was above benchmark, so we support retaining the current benchmark. This also raises the importance when using retailer data of having a benchmark in place or another process to verify that these costs represent the behaviour of an efficient retailer. So overall, we're still very supportive of the VDO. However, in making the final decision, again, we urge the ESC to consider the proposed increases in light of the impact on Victorians, particularly those on low incomes or in vulnerable circumstances. It's important to keep in mind the human impacts of these decisions. People will be switching off their heating this winter, they'll be skipping meals and other essentials to get by. Ensuring people can access government support and payment assistance from their retailer has a critical role to play in helping people weather these price rises. Constraining price rises to the absolute minimum required is just as important. And we do need a bigger conversation on effective concessions and support alongside the price debate. Thank you. I believe I'm handing over to Emma.
Right. Thanks, Stephanie. Some important observations there. Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. And yes, we have Emma King, from the Chief Executive Officer from the Victorian Council of Social Services. Thanks, Emma, for joining us today, and we'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Dean, and to Stephanie as well. And I'll apologise in advance. I'm at the Health Summit today and I've stepped out to find what I hope is a quiet corner. So I seriously hope it remains quiet. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we all meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and to emerging leaders, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And of course, it's always great to follow from Stephanie, with Stephanie as well. I guess first things first, and to state the obvious, and that is that energy is an essential service. So how would any of us be able to function if we can't turn on the lights, if we can't turn on our heater, if we can't turn on our oven? Yet today we're staring down the barrel of what is a 30% increase price hike in the cost of energy of an essential service, and a price hike that will effectively render an essential service to be a luxury for Victorians who are doing it tough. If we push ahead based on the draft decision, the consequences are going to be dire. So make no mistake, it will force the most vulnerable members of our community to choose between whether they heat or whether they eat, a decision that none of us should have to make. It will result in older members of our community literally staying in bed all day to stay warm. Again, an unacceptable proposition. And it will see people become sick, and it will see people in some cases die. It's hard to fathom that a hike of this magnitude is being proposed when we are in the midst of a perfect storm. We're seeing huge increases in the cost of housing, food, fuel, and now energy. We've got CPI that's running at about 7%, and we've got household income that's stagnated. And let's not forget the highly concerning data from the ESC's own reports. So the number, and Stephanie touched on this as well, but the number of Victorians who need extra help from their energy retailer jumped 3% in the 6 months to December. The average amount of debt that a Victorian owes to their energy retailer has also grown by 3%. And we have thousands of Victorians who cannot afford their ongoing energy bills, and they now owe an average debt of around $1,800. And the effects of this we know are scarring. VCOS members who are on the front line of this cost of living crisis are deeply worried, which again, we heard from Stephanie. They're seeing demand for their services like never before. And also keep in mind, some of this is coming from people that they've never put up their hand for help or assistance before as well. So every day they see people who are struggling to buy food, they see people who are struggling to pay for medication, and they see people making unacceptable choices to literally keep the lights on. So, as I said, Stephanie touched on a number of these points in her presentation. So if ours overlap, I apologise, but I guess it's because this is the world in which we're living. These are the facts, and this is what our communities are actually living through. So here are some other contrasting facts. Origin Energy made an underlying profit of $407 million in 2022. In the same year, AGL made a statutory after-tax profit of $860 million. It's a little harder to get profit data for the other big players, Alinta and Energy Australia, as they're privately owned by offshore entities. And in the delivery of essential service, and this is an essential service, what do we put first? Do we put people or do we put profits? The VDO was established to protect people from the harshest of market forces, especially people living in poverty or in hardship, and from dealing with some other kind of vulnerability. It's established to provide a safeguard and a benchmark for a fair, no-frills deal that all people can access. And VCOS absolutely supports the existence of the VDO. We believe it's an incredibly valuable part of Victoria's energy regulation landscape, but we have serious concerns about the current proposal to lift the VDO by 31%, inflating the average annual household bill by $426, keeping in mind that that is average, and we know some households will fill up much more so. Increasing the benchmark power price by more than 30%, just as people are struggling in what I would again describe as a perfect storm, is an abandonment of the VDO's original purpose. Make no mistake, a price hike of this magnitude will drive tens of thousands of Victorians, further into poverty. We'll see more people who are struggling to pay their rent, who are avoiding seeing their doctor, who are skipping meals, and who are going cold this winter. And this isn't academic, because we know our hospital data has shown that people literally die in winter when they can't afford heating. We've seen evidence of people who die of hypothermia because they cannot afford to put the heater on, or they're too scared to do it because they're worried about the cost of doing it and not being able to pay for their bills. VCOS recognises the proposed VDO increase is based on modelling which in part takes account for energy companies' retail profit margins, as well as other factors like wholesale and network costs. And this is part of the original design of the VDO. And as I mentioned earlier, we are really supportive of the VDO. But let me be really clear, people are more important than profits. Yes, it's a turbulent period in the energy sector, and no one is disputing that. Landing the transition of a greener economy is tricky. Foreign wars and the challenge of inflation add even more complexity. But between them, the power companies have got a guaranteed and a growing customer base in a way few other industries can actually claim the same. So let me put it this way. If we're saying that Victorians need to go cold this winter so that power companies can protect profit margins, then I think our system needs really serious review. The ESC has the power, as it calculates changes to the VDO, to select a different target retail operating margin. So let's do it. Let's not crush people in the process. And as an aside, I note your consultation paper for this review details the factors driving an increase in wholesale energy prices. It specifically mentions higher than expected demand due to an earlier start in winter last year. In the real world, this is what we call people being really cold. I'd urge the ESC, both in language and in practice, to give greater priority to the needs of actual people. Specifically, I do urge you to water down the proposed price increase that we're facing at the moment. Every cent more on a person's power bill has to be justified and justifiable. And currently, I just don't believe that that's the case. Our engagement in the past and the fact that I'm here today means that you're really open to this discussion, and I genuinely thank you for that. And it's in the spirit of this friendship and this collaboration that I'm here today. VCOS has and always will be laser focused on the needs and the lives of Victorians who are doing it really tough, and how we can change systems, policies and approaches to make their lives better, so that they can experience genuine health, well-being and happy lives. And again, I think that goes to what is the cost? What is the cost to Victorians if we implement a price increase of 31%? So again, I thank you for the opportunity to present to the forum today, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks firstly for taking the time out of your busy day, but also the issues you've raised definitely are front of mind as well for us, and appreciate the openness that you've provided with us. And this will be ongoing. Look forward to more engagement on this as we move forward from here. So I really appreciate the insights, building on what Steph talked about today. So thank you. Thanks, Emma. Now we have Bruce Mountain from Victoria, Professor Bruce Mountain from Victoria University with us today. Bruce, thanks for joining us. Appreciate the time that you've given, and I'll hand over to you for some of your thoughts.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Kate. I trust you can hear me. If you could just give me a thumbs up, Dean, so I know I can be heard. Excellent, thank you. So thank you to the ESC for asking me to speak. Perhaps just by way of context to my speaking at this event, I was asked by the media what I thought of the draft decision, and I offered a comment, as a consequence of which I've been encouraged to explain my views, and I think it's reasonable. If you don't shut up, you need to put up, and so I am putting up here. I don't have a slide pack, but what I'm going to do is talk to my screen about the ideas and the conceptions that lie under my comment. And my comment was very briefly to encourage the ESC to think again about the VDO level. And the focus of that comment was the allowance for wholesale prices. It's been quite interesting listening to the presentations and the slides so far, to hear this term wholesale costs and prices used interchangeably. The wholesale element of the bill is the only element that is arguably assessed through a market. The rest are regulatory assessments, essentially on the basis of costs. Perhaps the LGC or the green, we can assess that as a sort of price based on a market, but the wholesale is a cost element on the basis of a market price. And that brings into question what reliance and how we ought to be thinking about those prices in assessing the wholesale cost. And I think my main point is that throughout the last year or so, where we've been really from this time last year through extraordinary wholesale market price changes in both contract markets as well as spot prices, the cost of production for the vast bulk of electricity sold in Victoria has essentially remained unchanged. The cost of wind and solar, variable cost of production is very close to zero. The capital is actually financed. The capital costs may well have changed. The borrowing and other costs may have changed, but that's independent of wholesale changes in gas and coal prices. And likewise, still by far the vast bulk of our electricity comes from brown coal, which is purchased on long-term cost-based contracts. And those contracts have not varied as a consequence of changes in wholesale contract prices or spot prices. They haven't changed as a consequence of the war. They haven't changed as a consequence of the operation of our wholesale gas markets. So essentially, the prices that we've seen experienced in smart markets are a Victorian effect as a member of the national electricity market, and they reflect really black coal cost and price changes in New South Wales and Queensland to some degree, and perhaps even more so gas market changes, which in turn are impacted by LNG export markets, and indeed the extent to which our Australian markets are actually impacted by those. But the exposure of those gas prices to our electricity production is limited. And so essentially, over this entire period where, as we saw on Dean's slide earlier, the average contract price roughly tripled, spot prices at their worst in around June, July, went up fivefold from what they were at the long-time average. Those increases only impacted a very small proportion of the electricity that's sold. It may well have impacted small retailers who buy on contract, who perhaps didn't buy on contract. And as we know, it certainly impacted one of the major producers who had sold forward and then found that their brown coal generator packed up just when they actually needed it. But that's a supply operating risk. It doesn't impact the cost of supply to the end customer. So that's my first point, and that's an overriding point. And when the ESC has used a methodology that essentially is a lagging indicator on the basis of it is a forward estimate over time of the contract market prices, it's lagging in that it's influenced by that past. I do believe it's going to entrench a windfall profit in respect of most electricity sold in our state. Might not be the case for smaller retailers who need to purchase on a contract, but because the cost of supply is largely unchanged, a very sizable hike in the allowance for wholesale prices, I think, will translate into a windfall profit for most power sold. That's my first point. My second point is to question the extent to which we should look at contract markets as a reasonable estimate of the fair cost, hedged cost of power. Those contract markets are impacted by their own issues of concentration of buyers and sellers in that market, of the extent to which wholesale spot prices flow through into those, of how liquid those markets are, and they are illiquid, certainly beyond a year or so. And I think big questions are worth asking on the extent to which those contract market prices are a reasonable reference in general. There's a secondary issue, which is the enormous complexity and judgment that's needed to assess what those contract market prices are saying. Do you have regard to annual contracts? Do you have regard to quarterly contracts? What weight do you put on caps versus swaps? What mix of hedging strategy do you use? Do you use a consistent policy over time, or do you imagine retailers being rational entities and thinking about the upside or downside of hedging or not, might look at wholesale prices and alter hedging strategy, and hence buy a different mix of swaps and caps as wholesale prices have indeed surged? And that hasn't happened. There's been a consistent way of actually seeing it over time, a very static way of seeing it, which I know a number of the energy retailers had actually characterized as not really a proper understanding of the way they hedge in the wholesale market. So I think there's a great deal of judgment on the interpretation of those contract market prices, and you can get very different outcomes of a suitable index or a suitable price or a suitable cost of the wholesale by looking at those markets in a different way over time. My third point is, and this is perhaps somewhat outside of the ESC's bailiwick, and I think might justify a reference to the government. It strikes me that policy makers in Australia at both a federal and a state level have really not accepted the electricity and gas prices that we see in the wholesale market. They've capped gas and coal prices as a way of changing prices in wholesale power and gas prices. That represents their view that the prices expressed in those markets are not socially acceptable. Different people will have different arguments as to whether that's intervention or not and what the definition of a market is and so on. That's a secondary point. The key point is the policymakers who establish the policy under which the government governs, under which price controls are set, have established a different view of those markets. And that's only actually reflected in the ESC's judgment in a secondary effect, in as much as that view has then been expressed in the contract prices. I think that's unsatisfactory. I think it would be appropriate for the ESC to seek a reference from the government as to what its views are on policy on electricity pricing. I've mentioned the price caps implemented by the wholesale government. I do believe that the Victorian government itself, although it hasn't capped prices, has intervened, most notably by shifting energy policy, notably by re-establishing the SEC. And in that, thinking quite differently about electricity provision and the role of markets. And again, I think it would be suitable to seek a reference to the government on the extent to which policy changes might be given effect in a different approach to the assessment of the price cap, or at least that part of the, or not the price cap, the setting of the wholesale component in a reference price. Thirdly, or fourthly, actually, investment in our national electricity market is increasingly policy driven. I've mentioned the SEC, but VRET, storage target, are all elements of governments driving investment through policy. We are increasingly, more obviously, not looking to markets to provide investment incentives only. Given that context, I think a price control which imagines that the market price is actually a key thing, and we can't seek to change it because we're worried about the incentives on that on new capital. I think fails to have regard to the fact that government is seeking to influence investment through mechanisms quite different to the market itself. Finally, just to recap a point which I've made a bit earlier, I think a static approach to the assumption of the hedging strategy, the way retailers are going to react to wholesale markets in the contract market, the range of swaps that they have and the range of caps that they have, I think that static view of it, which is the way the ESC has implemented it, I don't think is actually necessarily valid. I think as a matter of commercial operation in the market, once those wholesale contract market prices had reached such very high levels, I think retailers will actually realistically have said perhaps they're not going to seek to swap the spot price. How much higher can it go? And perhaps they might have put more weight on caps. And that different portfolio may be reflected in the assessment of the wholesale market. And doing that, even with the same wholesale market prices that you're looking at, could well give you a very different wholesale price element as part of the price cap. So for all of those reasons, I encourage the ESC to think again about the allowance for wholesale costs in the VDO. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce, for those insights. You've laid a couple of challenges down there. Always appreciate your views, so thank you very much for your time today. Next, our final guest presenter today, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session. Jane Singh from the Australian Energy Council. Hi, Jane. Good morning. Thank you for your time today, and I'll just hand over to you, and I think we have 10 minutes set aside for your overview today, then we'll move to Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'll just, similar to Bruce, I'll just do a sound check. Is that too loud or not loud enough? Is that a fine audio? Great, thank you. Thank you for that. So just a very brief introduction, the Australian Energy Council, we're a peak body. We represent retailers and generators in the electricity system in the context of this conversation here today. I've got a few slides, so I might just, I need to flag to yes, someone has control of the clicker, as I'd call it. So I just want to talk through 3 key points today. First of all, I think some of the previous presenters did talk about the key drivers of the price change, so I'll just quickly run over those. The other thing I want to talk about, importantly, is the importance of a stable system and how it actually benefits everyone across the supply chain, and importantly to customers as well. And then we do have a few items to flag for the ESC to monitor. We'll go into those more in detail when we put in our submission, but I just want to touch on a couple as well. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, sorry. Wonderful. Thank you. So this was touched on previously by the ESC, but this is just, I guess, a graphical representation of the price increase for domestic customers. And the graph on the left has indeed been extracted from the draft decision. And the graph on the right is just acknowledging where those changes are. And I think, as mentioned in the previous presentation, you can see that the wholesale and the network component, in particular the wholesale component, is the main driving element in there. And I guess it's also important to acknowledge that the GST is a function of those as well. And indeed, the retail margin is a percentage. So it is the key driver of the price increase. And as we've heard before, it's really been driven by domestic and international factors. And we did see those costs coming through the trading market in terms of futures and also spots. So next slide, please. So look, in the context of this discussion, I thought it was important to frame the VDO in the context of its actual objectives. The VDO represents a simple, trusted and reliably priced electricity option that safeguards consumers who are unable or unwilling to engage in the electricity market in Victoria. So it's for people who are not accessing the market prices that are there. So just restating that in the terms of the context for this mechanism. Next slide, please. So stability. The system stability really relies on allowing retailers to recover their efficient costs, and in particular in the context of a consistent principle-based approach. Now, on the whole, the AEC really commends the ESC for what we see as a difficult but very important decision they've made in sticking to a stable and principle-based approach in this draft decision. In particular, once again, from that draft decision paper, there's a sentence there, a couple of sentences there that I've extracted from there, which we agree with. In allowing retailers to recover efficient costs, it will help avoid costly retailer of last resort events, such as those affecting the United Kingdom in the prior financial year. It will also ensure that retailers continue to invest in the industry to drive the types of innovation that lead to long-term sustainable cost efficiencies. So it's that longer-term stable view that we see as really quite critical, particularly at this heightened time of volatility. The 2 key elements that I want to draw out that underpin a stable system are the clarity of the regulator's role in the system And once again, the consistency in that approach. They're very essential to deliver a stable, supported system. Next slide, please. So look, in a regulated price jurisdiction, it poses challenges in regard to the expectations that it can set for customers' expectations on a regulator's role and their role as setting prices to be efficient and cost reflective. So this slide here really draws that out. It's a really important distinction to be aware of. So the regulator's role is to set cost reflective, efficient prices that befit a prudent retailer. And the expectation that consumers quite often have in these regulated environments for the regulator to set a low price of energy. Now, at these heightened times of, high cost environments we're in, that differential between those perceptions, I think, become quite amplified. So we've heard today the challenges of customers in facing cost of living challenges and the impact that heightened electricity costs are imposing on that, and where the AEC definitely share those concerns. But the point of this slide is to really highlight the role of the different actors in the system and to emphasise that those roles are really important for system stability. So on the left there, we have the regulator. So just to reiterate, it's their role to run a stable process, to set a reasonable cost reflective price. For retailers, the role of the retailers is to support their customers by offering programs and tailored packages and products. And there are other actors in the system, other roles. There's various government support and community welfare supports that are available to customers. And as the ESC said, we would also encourage customers to access those channels where and if they need that. And particularly recently announced the energy relief package, for example. Now, the final limb is an important one. In instances where the government feels that these existing support mechanisms are not sufficient, then they have an option to provide additional support directly to customers. It's important to note that the government's role on the right is distinct from the regulator's role on the left. Next slide, please. So the other component to a stable system we see is consistency. So we acknowledge that setting regulated prices is not a perfect science, but the most important thing is that the regulator sticks to the model that they've chosen. The main reason for this is because the VDO is actually a signal for the participants in the market. It's a bit like the observer effect. When a scientist observes a specimen, quite often they impact the way that specimen is behaving. The exact happens in this context as well. So in response to the regulators' telegraphed and process that they've put out there, businesses, retailers change their business processes. They act differently in response to that. And that indeed is what has happened. So in regard to the wholesale energy cost approach, is being based on the prices for 12 months prior. This is a key input into retailers' forecast revenue. It cascades through the way they do their hedging strategies and make their investment choices and organise their businesses. Another example is in regard to the acquisition costs and activities for retailers. The allowance has signalled to retailers that they need to engage in these capabilities and offer products in a competitive market. So consistency really is the underpinning of a confidence, and the confidence really does drive a healthy market that keeps regulatory risk low. It leads to more competition and, importantly, better outcomes for customers. Next slide, please. So the other thing we wanted to just quickly touch on was the points of compromise that we know are in the mechanisms, and that's just by the very nature of them. So we understand that regulators have to take a materiality approach, and they're always balancing, you know, competing factors. They need to run a process that indeed is streamlined enough for their own resources, etc., and is simple and transparent for all the stakeholders involved. And they're balancing that against coming up with a fair, accurate approach to what those prices and how they reflect the costs of a prudent, efficient retailer. So the diagram on the right was my attempt at showing that a process and method that may be adopted does by and large pick up most things. But factors can change in the markets. And over time, those factors that are outside or deemed to be not material enough to be captured in those formula may change. And in the current market where we're seeing all sorts of changes through the energy transition and other things, we're just sort of noting that some of these need to be monitored. Well, they always need to be monitored, but I think at this time, some of that monitoring needs particular emphasis. Next slide, please. So here's some to flag that we want to flag just because of certain trends and new things in particular. I might just quickly pick on the first two that the two that I think are most important to draw out, and then I'll go to the others. So the first one is the increasing overall bill size. Now, the way the formula is being applied for that, for bad debts for customers, is it's being applied on a $1 per customer basis. We note, though, that this can actually cause a cross-subsidy, or is causing a cross-subsidy, whereby smaller customers are subsidising larger consumers for this cost element. As those prices rise, I think this is an area of cross-subsidy that's embedded in the way that formula is delivered that needs attention, and it needs to be constantly monitored. And if it's deemed to be materially enough, come to a material level, then a new approach may be considered. The other one is in regard to the extreme wholesale market movements. Now, we acknowledge that there's a volatility allowance that's applied. We note, though, that there are other extreme movements that you can see in the wholesale market, and indeed, we've observed some of these in more recent times, where the price and the load sits at a point where the price is above the value of the base swaps, and also importantly above the value of the WEC, and the demand warrants that the cost that's incurred by that retailer is higher than the WEC, such that the retailers are incurring a negative margin over time. It's just an area, once again, that we think requires monitoring to consider whether there's an allowance supplement required for that. The other ones in there are more, or we know are already on the radar of the ESC, and then including the weighting of the retailer ROC data, and to what extent there may be a gap between the derived ROC and that for a startup or a tier 2 retailer, just so we can maintain sufficient competition and not have too high a barrier entry for those new retailers who quite often come up with innovative products for customers. I think that might be the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Jane. Appreciate your time today and for your insights. Marcus, I think over to you to host the Q&A session from here.
Thank you, Dean. If anyone has any questions, can you perhaps either put them in the chat box or raise your hand? I'm sort of waiting for some to come through. I'm probably going to, otherwise I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask a couple of questions of the panelists first. I might have one for Steph, but also Emma, if you're still there. You touched on at the end of your presentation, Stephanie, and actually Jane touched on it well about the role of direct intervention, and we know the federal government has proposed 1.5 billion of energy bill relief, but we don't know the details of that. And Steph, at the end, you talked about roles of concessions and direct support, and we know there are a number of people that are not accessing the current schemes there to assist. So do you have any ideas that for us as a regulator or policymakers we could be doing to target and get better uptake of some of those things. So Steph or Emma, do you have any thoughts of things we could be thinking about in government in that direct intervention space?
Did you want, it's Emma speaking, did you want to go first, Steph, and then I can jump in, or tell me if you'd rather do it the other way around?
You're welcome to go first, Emma.
I can go first if you like. One of the things we've found in our research is I think there's about, I might have to figure out, it's a roughly 15% of people who don't access all of their concessions. So our research has found there's a range of reasons for that. One is some people are really embarrassed. They don't like asking for help. They don't want to ask for their concessions. Another one of the issues is it comes to the digital divide and the fact that a lot of low income people actually don't have access to digital connection, which impacts all areas of their life. But as we're being pushed more and more online and ability often to find concessions is online, it means that people are missing out. So a number of our member organisations, so whether it ranges from, I know some people I suspect on this call from, say, Brotherhood of St Lawrence or Good Shepherd Microfinance or Neighbourhood Houses Victoria, for example, will sit with people who who might come in and ask for help for around one thing and say to them, look, what other support do you need? If you're having difficulties with your energy company, for example, let's find, actually, if you reached out to your energy company in the first place, what are the calls we can help you make? But let's also check that you're getting access to all of the concessions that you should. So we know there's a number of barriers in the way. Digital divide is a significant issue when it comes to that. And people not necessarily knowing what they're eligible for, where they should go. It's I know that the Victorian government's put together a site that does make it easier to look at where you go and what concessions you might be eligible for and what you might be able to access. The challenge is for a number of people, it's still pretty confusing, I think, for a number of people to access. There is also a number I know that people can access to call. I don't know it off the top of my head, but again, we've been encouraging people to do that. And I'm sure Cal, for example, is doing the same thing in terms of assisting people. I look at the core work that Cal does. Part of that is often having people reach out in the first instance. I think sometimes there's a perception that a lot of people, they're sort of deliberately not paying their bill. Generally, people are pretty humiliated when they can't actually pay their bill and they're scared to even open that envelope when it comes through around what a bill might be and they've just got no capacity to pay for it. But Steph, I'm sure there's other things you'd add into that. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, absolutely. Access to concessions and reducing that friction around an ability to access, say, ERGs is really important. We talk with people all the time who've had trouble accessing ERGs, whether it's to do with conversations with the retailer and the forms not being sent, or just trouble actually accessing it or filling it out. As well, agree eligibility, and I think we need to expand our understanding of what vulnerability looks like. Like I said, the biggest issue that people are calling the National Debt Helpline about is mortgage stress. And some of these people may not know about concessions that are available, or, they wouldn't put themselves in that category, or they wouldn't qualify for the concessions. So, yeah, I think we do need to have a bigger look at, who qualifies, and what they can get for support. And indeed, we're often helping people for whom the ERGs don't cover the full amount of the energy debt. Like I said, the amounts are increasing substantially in our casework, the amount of energy debt. So again, it's looking at those concessions. And just a final point that I think is really relevant to this debate, which I touched on, which is just the houses and energy efficiency and renters and people in social housing not having an ability to take measures to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. And I think that's really important as we look to other things as well in the energy debate.
Thanks, Steph and Emma. I think some interesting ideas there. I wonder, Jane, do you have any perspective from the retailers about things that could be done with that direct support, or things that could be done better that might assist those that are perhaps most in need or are missing out on assistance that would be warranted?
If it's okay, I might pass to my colleague Ben Barnes, because he's actually been working in another jurisdiction on a similar suite of topics quite recently. So I might pass over to Ben to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. No worries. Look, I agree with Stephanie and Emma. To be honest, I really think the challenge is access and making sure that customers who are eligible are able to get concessions. And the framework in Victoria, I would say, with a percentage-based regime, we see as the best model that is used here. So I do think that is the most effective way to deliver support to customers. The challenge is, how do we make sure that all customers are able to get those concessions? And the approach that Jane's touching on is the energy bill relief package. And I think there's a really challenging discussion about how governments and retailers can interact with regards to concessions. There's very strict processes that the governments have that make it quite difficult for us to get concessions into customers' hands, and that it's one of those instances where we have very aligned incentives. Retailers and customers have exactly the same incentive to get those concessions and are really keen to. The challenge, I think, though, is that government processes are often very inflexible and can create challenges for real world scenarios. So simple things like addresses being wrong can cause weeks and months of effort from a customer and a retailer, and ultimately result in customers giving up. So I think the key point, rather than talking about more concessions, I think the key point here is making sure that customers get concessions and making it as simple as possible, through both ERGS forms to be as short and simple as possible, to government eligibility checks, or federal government eligibility checks to be the same.
Thanks, Ben. Another one for Steph. You've expressed reservations about the retail operating margin. Do you have any thoughts on what could be alternative approaches to either how we currently set it, or what might be a more appropriate level to set it at?
I'm going to follow Jane's lead and throw to our expert, Luke Lovell, who's also on the line. Sorry, Luke.
That's completely fine, Steph. And thanks for the question, Marcus. I mean, I think Steph captured it in our presentation. Really, the focus would be looking at retail data again and noting that if it's showing a decreasing margin, and as the Commission's doing for operating costs, should we consistently be taking retailer data as well for the margin and reflecting what the margin is in the market, I think would be our suggestion.
Thanks, Luke. I did have, and I see Adrian Merrick's made a comment in there. I don't know whether, Adrian, you want to raise it, but it was probably similar to a question I was going to ask Bruce. So I might ask Bruce first, and then Adrian, whether you want to comment on what you put in the chat. Bruce, if we said prices based perhaps on current contract prices instead of the trade weighted for the 12 months, how do you think that might affect perhaps all participants in the retail market, noting a lot aren't vertically integrated, and what sort of policy impacts or what might be needed to deal with that, noting we've got probably retailers here that aren't. We've also got embedded networks here as well that perhaps don't have any vertical integration. So just have any thoughts how sort of the approach we're advocating may actually flow through, though, into the market? And perhaps, Adrian, if you want to add anything after Bruce's comments.
Okay, I think there's two aspects to it. Firstly, what does a change of methodology mean for wholesale price? And then what's the relative impacts? And as I said, with the same set of contract prices you're looking at, you can come up with a very different answer on it through different perspectives on the mix of swaps and caps and averaging periods and so on and so forth. So quite what the effect will be will really depend on the changes that you make. I note, for example, the weighted average, or not the weighted average, but the price at which Q1 swaps in Victoria closing out is about $54 a megawatt hour. Q2 have been 125 on the 10th of February, and they were down to 105 on the 10th of March. Looking at the average wholesale prices in Victoria, they are reflecting, you know, the effect of lots of solar production and lots of wind and the downward impact on that. So we're starting to see a reversion, or not starting to see, we've seen for quite some time now, a reversion to the sorts of spot market prices that we've seen over a long period of time, for which the aberration from May last year, mainly May, until about September really sticks out as a sore thumb. So depending how you view that period as an aberration and the weight that you put on it and all the other factors, you can get to a very different price. On your substantive question, yeah, there is a policy question here, and you can liken it to how policy affects credit markets and banks. We've got our 4 pillars going back over quite some time, an explicit policy in banking, which allows concentration, but very high security, as a consequence of which the competition in our banking markets is often spoken of as weak, but retail margins and mortgages are higher than we can get elsewhere, and that's a policy suite. I would argue the electricity retail market policy suite has been somewhat similar, a perspective that retail market intervention ought to be around headroom, creating the space for competition. I would argue the VDO has effectively done that the way we've analysed it in the past. It hasn't been a floor price, it's been a ceiling price, other than over the recent past. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the price that customers are paying. That's the price that customers who engage in the market effectively get. So I think tightening up the wholesale is going to reduce some of the headroom. I think may potentially make it harder for new entrants. On the other hand, the new entrants compete generally at the bottom of the market. They can only compete on price often. They don't have the reputation and the brand and other things that allow them to easily get a foot in. And arguably, they'd carry on discounting how they were. And so the effect of a tightening would be to effectively decrease the windfall profits to the largely vertically integrated suppliers. And from an economic and public policy point of view, that would be no bad thing. So answering this, as I am on a Zoom chat at 1,000,000 miles an hour, on balance, I would imagine that the retail market effects on competition would be relatively muted, and the dominant effect would be to put a cap on windfall profits driven by the difference between the allowance and the cost.
Thanks, Bruce. And Adrian, I see you popped up, and whether you or any of the other retailers might want to speak about perhaps your observations or what you're seeing in the market and how exposed you are to these contract prices going forward.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to make sure I heard Bruce right, because it's a noisy office. There's a reduction in the wholesale allowance, which puts a windfall tax effectively on the generators that have been burning brown coal at roughly the same prices. And yet retailers who have already bought energy at those inflated prices that are now reflecting the draft BDO will still be offering heaps of discounts. Is that right? Is that right?
Well, it depends the way the retailers have indeed contracted. If they had purchased those contracts, it may well tighten things up for them. If they hadn't purchased contracts in that way at those premium prices, it wouldn't. So it would depend entirely on the mix of their own mix. It will very obviously decrease the windfall to the brown coal dominated retailers, but the effect on the new entrant retailers that purchase in contract market, I couldn't know for sure. It would vary from one to the other. But I do think your concern may well be valid for some.
Thanks, Bruce. Are there any other retailers that want to comment on that point or have some other questions for the Commission or the panellists?
Yeah, can I just say something? It's Con Woodso from Red Energy. I just wanted to, just to sort of explore Bruce's point a little bit more. I'm a little bit unclear about what Bruce is actually saying, because in the end, I think what his position is, or what he's basically saying is that for vertically integrated generators were actually looking at the actual fuel costs in their contracts, and yet the other retailers that are not actually vertically integrated would actually need to go into the market and use hedges. So what's not clear to me is how that proposition would actually play out in the market itself.
Okay.
Would you have a video price for small retailers, and then would you have a different video price and a different methodology for vertically integrated players?
Yeah. So
I'm just struggling with what you're saying. That's all. So,
yeah. Okay. How my concern of the effect of vertical integration and relatively constant underlying costs is taken account of in a regulatory control is not something I'm setting out a precise idea on now. I'm pointing to the issue, and I'm recognizing the concern that retailers who purchase through contracts may well be negatively impacted as a consequence of dealing with this. But on these things, as with every other bit of the wholesale market determination in the video, there's trade-offs to be had. There will be retail market effects. They'll impact retailers in a different way. The substantive issue is, to me, it's a hard fact. The underlying cost of production of the vast bulk of electricity sold in Victoria has been unchanged, largely unchanged. And when you have a price reference, and that price reference is influential not just for customers that are on it, but in the market generally, you can give rise to windfall profits. Policymakers recognize that, and in Australia and internationally, they've intervened in market in big ways to address that from a policy perspective. I think it's relevant in Victoria. I don't think it's been addressed in the video draft decision. I think it should be put on the table. I'm not recommending at this stage, Con, any prescription on how it ought to be taken into account.
Okay, I was just going to say, would your proposition also be symmetrical? Would it work both ways when prices are low? I'm not, yeah.
So are you asking if brown coal prices rise, there should be an increase in the wholesale component, or?
No. Look, anyway, perhaps it needs to be explored further. I just have concerns with the actual operational sort of aspects of what your proposal is, because I think it would be challenging to basically obtain information on commercial contracts, coal or gas or oil contracts that retailers have, vertically integrated generators actually have, and to use that as a basis for making some sort of VDO price against, say, retailers that don't have those sort of arrangements that contract in markets. It's just a bit confusing to me, that's all.
Yeah,
but anyway,
just briefly, to avoid any doubt, I'm not recommending or saying you should demand contract information. This is an extremely imprecise process. The frontier methodology is one of a gazillion that you can choose in trying to understand how to interpret market prices. That problem will continue. That's unavoidable. And I'm not saying you need to demand or go into retailers' books and find out their underlying contract position so that you set as a price control or some kind of reference price for each. I'm certainly not saying that. I'm pointing to the gap between costs and prices and saying, here's something that ought to be taken into account. And it would be consistent with policy that the regulator does that.
Yeah, okay, and that's fine. It's just that proposition needs to be operational if it's going to have any credibility. That's my point. But anyway, that can be taken up other times. Yeah.
Thanks, Con. Thanks, Bruce, for those points. Perhaps one for Jane. Given we're probably seeing global prices for gas and coal appear to be significantly lower than this time last year, but we're still seeing quite high prices on the ASX. compared to that stage. Vigo views what is keeping these prices so high. I think as Dean showed that when we set the video last year, I think prices were probably around about the $48 mark for a base swap. They're now about 85, even post-intervention. Do you have any view, is it the uncertainty going forward or what may be driving that, those prices continuing to stay quite high? I think they are easing back a bit next year when you look at future markets, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, perhaps, Dean, can I just briefly say, and you did kind of say it in your last sentence, when you look at the 24-25, they're back down to 60. And we've seen Q1 prices go down to 54 and Q2 are on a downward trend. So, and look at the open interest and the traded volumes, they are relatively small. So again, looking at these prices, how do you interpret them? Don't just see a price and put all the value in it. You've really got to step into it. And then you have to understand how much of that price is trading between merchants as opposed to between energy retailers. So anyway.
Thanks, Bruce. Ben or Jane, do you want to comment on what we're seeing in the futures contract market at the moment?
Well, yeah, I think some of those elements that make up the prices that Bruce have mentioned are relevant. And I think our main point is that if, to the extent the regulator has developed a method to determine the wholesale energy cost allowance, it's the important thing is that's consistent, because we know that the current retailers are buying in that market that Bruce and you just commented on. So they're buying contracts in the market, and to the extent that the frontier economics process does indeed look at trade weighted elements, it looks at it, applies a particular hedging strategy in its theoretical prudent retailer model. So it takes data from this current period we are in now for next year. So we would be very hopeful that if this year continues to be and tracks to be less volatile and on overall basis, trade weighted basis, lower prices than we saw last year, then the ESC's method should indeed mean that the lower prices will flow through to the VDO in future years more quickly than we might see in other jurisdictions that have got a different method. So it's about the building blocks for that formula and sticking to the formula, because we do know that retailers are acting on that formula today in the way that they're choosing to set up their hedging strategies.
Can I just briefly comment on that, Jane? And I did note in your slide pack that reference. We as a research project sought to replicate what was done in the VDO in the first iteration. And try as we may, replicating what Frontier had done, we found unbelievably complex. So quite how retailers have done that and operationalized something which requires Frontier's grinding of the handle of a spot price as the basis of a hedging strategy. Quite how they've done that would be a complete mystery to me. Quite different to the British context, where the price cap and the hedging of the strategy that Ofgem set was eminently doable. That's certainly not the case that I can see here in Victoria.
So I note Frontier's in the room, so they might choose to comment on it. But I think the challenge, we've echoed that challenge, Bruce. We have certainly had difficulties over the years exactly replicating some of the things that come out of Frontier's strike model, and they've gone to a lot of effort to give us other factors that enable us to be more confident that we can get closer to it. But I would echo your concerns. There is a difficulty in any price setting model, and particularly one that uses proprietary decision-making tools that can make it difficult for direct replication. I think the point Jane is making is that we have some sort of high-level factors, such as a decision and a really consistent approach over 5 years to expect retailers to make purchases over a 12-month period. And having that expectation does drive retailers to make purchasing decisions over a period. And when prices were high, I think your model sort of suggests that maybe they should have hoped that they would be lower in the future. And as they are today, if they bought all their contracts at a later stage, they would have been better off than had they bought them over the previous 12 months. I think the challenge that we are in is that we have an expectation on retailers to make stable purchasing decisions over a period of time has been foreshadowed in multiple decisions. And while we can't replicate the exact elements of the frontier model, there is a broad understanding of the types of outputs that it gives, and that gives retailers a signal to try and deliver an outcome similar to that.
Thanks for that, Ben. Frontier are here. I think, Andrew, if you're still there, do you want to have any comment on this, given it is sort of getting into the details of your model? And I guess we ourselves have looked at various models. I guess we found different models are coming up with probably not dissimilar outcomes, though, I think. Andrew, if you're here, do you want to make any comment on the modelling and the modelling assumptions that underpins it? Or, you know, the full details of the modelling is, of course, on our website and released with the decision. But Andrew, if you want to add anything in.
Sure. Yeah, I am here. So there is a bit of our modelling that depends on portfolio optimization, and I accept that is going to be hard to replicate unless you want to delve into some portfolio optimization theory. But all that does is tell us what a prudent contract position will be. The outcome of that modelling has been very consistent for the 15 odd years we've been doing it. Also very consistent with the same results that the AER, for instance, uses for the DMO. They use a different method to come up with it, but fundamentally, what most people find is that it's prudent to sign swaps to about average load and then caps to cover you up to peak. But fundamentally, what drives the approach isn't that sort of contract position. The overwhelming driver of the wholesale component is contract prices. So, you know, as I guess we've heard a number of times, the contract prices we use are the 12-month trade-weighted contract prices. And we use that because, you know, what we've heard from retailers, and I guess what we've observed through a number of retail reviews, is that tends to be the way that most retailers will hedge. So our approach is essentially seeking to replicate the costs that retailers will hedge. We don't try and second guess what the market price is going to be. I think that's a very dangerous thing for retailers to do. If they start trying to form views that they think the market prices are too high or too low and they're just going to wait around until the prices get better, I think that's how we see retailers end up going broke. So we don't assume that a retailer is going to do that. We assume the retailer takes the market price as the market price. And I think, you know, their ability to do otherwise is pretty limited. There's only a couple of retailers in Victoria of the few dozen that are vertically integrated that do have an alternative. Most of the retailers in the market, most of the competition in the market is coming from retailers who don't really have a viable option other than these contracts, I think.
Thanks, Andrew. Popped up briefly. Do you have something you want to add? Or?
The extent of vertical integration is something that there'll be a range of views on. Vertical integration might be incomplete. It might be around hedging peak exposure and so on. So these things can't be made as kind of blanket statements. As to competition coming from those who've got contracts, I dare say at a price level, that's probably often true, and that's a bit of an indictment on our market and ought to be raising severe concerns that that's where the source of price competition is coming. It's raising up again retail market competition issues, which I think are underlying mood music to all of this. When it's all said and done, once we in our regulatory fora have had our debates and gone through our technicalities, the person in the street will quite reasonably say, tell me about the difference in the cost of supply for the vast bulk of electricity sold in Victoria versus these prices. And the hard reality is the underlying cost of supply has hardly changed, and therein lies a problem. And it's constructs of markets and competition that underlie all of this, and policy, which is why I say we can have this debate and this is great, and far be it from me to judge regulatory processes, but it strikes me a fair bit of this is policy dependent. and policymaker guidance ought to be sought.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bruce. We're probably coming towards the end of the session. There is a comment, Adrian, you've made about the ABC running a story today. I guess we haven't had contact with the ABC and didn't brief them ahead of today's forum. I think some of the participants may have, as Bruce noted in there. His views on this were probably made known. That's actually why we invited Bruce to speak. And I think some of the other participants, Emma and Steph, had fairly immediate comments, which was why they were approached. Kelk, I think, spoken each year at these forums. So it's not something that we've sort of pre-done or pre-briefed the media on. That's right. So I'll just clarify that we haven't briefed the media ahead of the forum, but some participants may have spoken to the media. I think Bruce even admitted that's why he did appear today, because we did approach him initially after his comments and he declined, and then he said because he did speak to the media, he would actually participate. So just to clarify that, Adrian, it's not us sort of preempting what was going on.
Yeah, no, fair enough. No, it wasn't suggesting it was the ESC. I was just curious to read some of those quotes as people were saying them. That was like really fast journalism otherwise.
No, that's okay. And I think the ABC was here today and probably picked up some new points as well. Look, Ray, thanks for everyone. I'll hand over to Kate. I don't think there's anything else in the chat or any hands up, and we've got a bit over time, but perhaps give Kate a bit of a chance to close out. And really, thanks for everyone turning up today. It's been a really interesting debate. It perhaps is a bit of an arcade world, the intricacies of future contract modelling of wholesale prices, but thank you all for participating and sharing your thoughts, and we really welcome written submissions on these issues as well. So, Kate, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Marcus, and thanks everyone for your questions and comments and the presentations. That discussion was a really valuable one we just had then. I think that was with a spirit of openness and genuine engagement. So my thanks to everyone around the table. I just wanted to, I know we're running a bit late, but I think it's always useful just to recap at a high level what we've heard. And I'll just do that quickly, given that we have gone over time, but it's been a good use of our time to hear directly from stakeholders. I think at a high level, what I've heard is there's ongoing support for the Victorian Default Offer. We heard that from the consumer representatives today in particular, with an emphasis on energy being an essential service. There was also an encouragement of a reminder of the video's original purpose and a query of what that reasonable price of the video should be. Did certainly hear very strongly from VCOS and CALC the serious concerns about the large proposed increases in the video, and it really shone a light on the human impact of the proposed price increases for us to have a think about. Also heard feedback on various of the cost stack elements of the video we're required to take into account under the pricing order in determining the video. In particular, there was that suggestion about reducing the retail margin being one method potentially to reduce the impact of the proposed video increase. Not surprisingly, there was a focus in the discussion on the wholesale electricity component in the Victorian Default Offer, particularly given the volatility in the energy markets over the past 12 months. What does that mean for consumers and of course, different types of energy businesses in the market? Certainly heard some feedback that our wholesale methodology may well have a disconnect between prices and actual costs incurred by energy businesses. There was a suggestion that there might be a windfall from some of those elevated prices for some retailers in the market, and we perhaps should be thinking about not passing on any impact of those high prices onto customers. So something for us to think about. Also, some feedback encouraging a stable approach to allow retailers to recover efficient costs with a consistent approach that looks at the longer term and what that means. Also heard the importance of access to concessions and assistance for Victorians and the way in which government and energy businesses and regulators can work together to make improvements. And a useful discussion, I guess, and feedback on the role of the regulator and the role of the regulator being a consistent and transparent one to ensure system stability, a bit of a dialogue around the role of regulators as opposed to policymakers. And I guess in the context of our role under the pricing order to determine the Victorian Default Offer, I think feedback today has really raised the opportunity heard that from you, Bruce, for what the ESC might do to seek a reference from government as to what its views are on the policy for electricity pricing, and in particular the setting of the wholesale component for VDO. So plenty for us to think about. Thank you very much for that very valuable discussion. I've found it very helpful to hear firsthand the issues and questions you've raised today. I'm sure my fellow commissioners agree as well as we move from draft to final. Plenty for us to carefully consider. My thanks also to Stephanie Tonkin from Consumer Action Law Centre, who's I think no longer with us, had to go off to other things, and likewise Emma King from the Victoria Council of Social Service. My thanks to Professor Bruce Mountain from the Victorian Energy Policy Centre for your thoughts and reflections, and also Jane Singh from the Australian Energy Council. Thanks for the presentations and the insights you've shared, and to my commissioners and commissioner staff who've put together today's session. If you haven't done so yet, we really encourage you to make comments or a formal submission to our draft decision by the 11th of April via Engage Victoria. Hopefully the discussion today has really helped to clarify some areas you'd like to submit to us for our careful consideration. In the meanwhile, if you've got any queries, comments or feedback on today's session, always really keen to get that from our stakeholders, but please get in touch with Jonathan Roberts or send the video team an email via vdo@esc.vic.gov.au. Thanks very much, everyone. We've run a fair bit over time, but it was a very good use of our time with you. Thanks for taking the time to attend the forum. Take care, and thanks again. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks very much.